He wasn't loud. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise his voice. He just sat in his assigned seat, and that was enough to make everyone around him uncomfortable. They saw a hoodie, not a CEO. They saw sneakers, not a shareholder. They didn't see power because they weren't used to seeing it there. But what they didn't realize was that the man they tried to move to the back of the plane owned a piece of the airline itself. And in the next 48 hours, he wouldn't just reclaim his seat, he would change the rules of an entire industry. This isn't just a story about one flight. It's about how dignity, once denied, can become a movement. And it all started with one word. Sir, you're in the wrong seat. They say power speaks loudest when it whispers. But what happens when power chooses not to raise its voice? When it sits quietly in the wrong seat, wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong time? The answer, it seems, is that the world around it panics. This is the story of Elijah Monroe, a man whose silence rewrote the policies of an entire industry. But this isn't just about one man. It's about the thousands of moments that go unnoticed, the slights that pile up, the assumptions that go unchecked, and the moment when someone finally says, enough. It started like any other day at the gate of Flight 739 to Chicago. A calm Thursday morning, boarding announcements echoing off polished terminal floors. Elijah Monroe, dressed in a weathered hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, boarded with a first-class pass in hand. He looked like someone returning home after a long week, not the CEO of a global tech conglomerate. He settled into seat 1A, placed his briefcase under the seat, and opened his phone to review notes for a board meeting scheduled later that afternoon. Enter Madison Sharp, the lead flight attendant. Clipboard in hand, brows furrowed, she paused when she saw Elijah seated. "Sir," she said, projecting just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "This section is reserved for premium passengers. You may have boarded the wrong group." Elijah, unbothered, held up his digital boarding pass. Seat 1A, first class. He didn't need to explain, but he did anyway, with calm precision. But Sharp didn't even look at the pass. She gestured for her colleague, Aaron Dempsey, a junior attendant, who approached already wearing an expression of skepticism. The tension in the cabin didn't rise all at once. It crept, one whisper at a time, one glance exchanged between passengers, one phone raised slowly to start recording. In seat 2A, an older man with a gold watch leaned forward. "Son," he said, with the kind of voice people use when they think they're being helpful. "Maybe there's been a mix-up. Happens all the time." Madison nodded. "Exactly. Let's double-check. Could I see your ID, sir?" It's important to pause here, not for dramatic effect, but for context. Elijah Monroe is not new to flying. His frequent flyer status with Silverlight Airlines wasn't just platinum, it was elite tier. Over 300,000 miles traveled. Dozens of boardrooms visited across continents, but none of that mattered. Not to the crew, not to the captain, not in that moment. Because what they saw wasn't a man with credentials, they saw a man who, in their eyes, didn't belong. Captain Russell Granger was called from the cockpit. Clean uniform, perfect silver hair, decades of experience. He looked Elijah up and down once and made a decision based on clothing and complexion alone. "Sir, I need you to move to your assigned seat so we can depart on time." Elijah didn't move. Instead, he presented his boarding pass, his ID, and his elite status card. Not one of them was examined. "Security," the captain muttered to Madison. "This is a disruption." Let's talk about that word. Disruption. In corporate settings, it means innovation. In airports, when applied to the wrong person, it becomes weaponized. The power dynamic shifts. Suddenly, the person being wronged becomes the problem. Elijah quietly started recording. Not because he wanted to escalate, but because he had learned, through years of watching others be ignored, that documentation was protection. As security was summoned, social media did what it does best. A passenger in seat 3C, Julia Arnett, a journalist who never travels without a charged phone, began live streaming. Passenger with a confirmed first-class seat being removed because crew doesn't believe he belongs, she narrated. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Number 1A, Silverlight discrimination, boarding while black. But the situation hadn't yet peaked. That would come when security arrived and demanded Elijah step off the plane for verification. He agreed calmly, no resistance. But just before he left, Julia caught something on his phone screen. Emergency board meeting moved. Conference room Alpha. 3 p.m. A coach passenger wouldn't have access to that kind of internal meeting. The narrative was unraveling. Fast. Outside the aircraft, the air was thick, not with hostility, but with that corporate sterility we've all come to recognize. Vague smiles, forced patience, and a growing crowd of bystanders quietly recording. Elijah Monroe stood at the gate, facing not just one supervisor, but a small wall of uniforms. Security Officer Jordan Alvarez, Ground Supervisor Lila Wexler, and Flight Operations Liaison Tom Hurst, each of them armed with tablets, radios, and assumptions. Lila took the lead. Mr. Monroe, your documentation appears to be in order, but given the concerns of our flight crew, we're asking that you take a seat in coach for this flight. The statement was delivered with that classic customer service tone, polished, rehearsed, and profoundly disconnected from justice. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. On what grounds? He asked. Because I followed every procedure and still ended up on the wrong side of perception? This moment, this standoff, wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about what happens when the idea of someone doesn't align with their reality. Elijah's identity challenged the assumptions of everyone in that terminal. The uniformed employees, the seasoned passengers, even the well-meaning observers. He had the right credentials, but not the expected image. Let's break this down analytically. Implicit bias in customer service has been well documented. A 2023 report from the National Travel Equity Commission found that Black passengers are 3 times more likely to be questioned about seat assignments, upgrades, and boarding privileges than their white counterparts, even when holding identical documentation. The system doesn't always need a villain. It just needs enough people with unchecked assumptions and the power to act on them. Back at the gate, Elijah requested to speak with a district manager. Lila laughed, a polite, dismissive chuckle. I'm the highest-ranking staff on duty, sir. There's no one else to escalate to. That wasn't true, of course, but it was a defense mechanism, the kind companies use to delay responsibility until a crisis goes viral. And viral it was becoming. Julia Arnett's live stream now had 2,000 viewers. The hashtag #seat1A was trending in 4 major cities. Comments poured in. This is textbook discrimination. Name the airline. He needs a lawyer. But Lila didn't see the screen. She was too busy trying to preserve order in a crumbling narrative. Elijah made a call. Short. Quiet. Tell them to begin without me. I'll call in. Julia caught a glimpse of the text on his phone after the call ended. Boardroom A assembled. Situation noted. People around her started to whisper. Why would a coach passenger be expected in a boardroom? Here's where the story pivoted from discrimination to revolution. Elijah reached into his briefcase, not for his documents, but for his business card. He handed it to Lila, who read it once and visibly paled. Elijah Monroe, Chief Executive Officer, Monroe Global Technologies. A company valued in the billions, an enterprise with nearly a quarter stake in the very airline that had just questioned his worth. That card was more than a job title. It was a mirror, one that forced everyone present to see themselves clearly. The passengers murmured. Phones zoomed in. Julia's voice trembled slightly on the live stream. This man owns part of the airline that just asked him to prove he belonged. Captain Granger returned, still unaware of the shift in gravity. We need to board now. What's the delay? Lila tried to answer, but her words stumbled. Elijah calmly gestured toward her radio. In about 2 minutes, he said. You're going to receive a call from your executive office. I suggest you answer it. And right on cue, the radio buzzed. Supervisor Wexler. Headquarters requesting immediate contact. Priority 1. It was the sound of a narrative falling apart. By now, the terminal didn't feel like an airport. It felt like a courtroom. Phones held like gavels. The crowd of passengers were no longer just bystanders, they were witnesses. And at the center, Elijah Monroe stood, not angry, not defensive, but composed. And that composure, more than any outburst ever could, demanded accountability. Lila Wexler's radio was still in her hand when it crackled again. Supervisor Wexler, please step aside and await incoming call from executive office. Chairperson Renard will speak directly. She looked at Elijah with a different gaze now, the kind reserved for someone who had just upended the chain of command. Let's stop here and analyze what's really happening. You see, in most public-facing institutions, especially airlines, the hierarchy is designed to minimize risk and maximize control. Complaints are managed, escalations are delayed, and power is assumed to rest with uniforms, not passengers. But Elijah flipped that paradigm, because while the system assumed he was just another flyer, it failed to see that this quiet man had been preparing for moments like this his entire career. When Lila took that call, the conversation was brief but transformative. Within seconds, her posture shifted. She wasn't managing a disruption anymore. She was managing a crisis. And the crisis wasn't Elijah. It was the system that had just exposed its own prejudice on a global stage. Elijah, now surrounded by at least 24 onlookers, didn't raise his voice. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a leather-bound portfolio, and began laying out documents on a nearby chair as if assembling evidence in a courtroom. First, his airline shareholder certificate, Monroe Global Technologies, 23% stake in Silverlight Airlines. Second, a breakdown of Silverlight's quarterly revenue, $8.4 billion in 2024, with Monroe Global contributing $1.7 billion annually through corporate travel. Third, and perhaps most damning, a printout of Silverlight's internal diversity funding report showing a $500,000 donation made by the Monroe Foundation just months prior to fund inclusion training that clearly hadn't reached this crew. Passengers gasped. The captain blinked twice, stunned. Julia Arnett turned her camera to Elijah's table, narrating, "He didn't just buy a seat, he bought a quarter of the airline." Commentary aside, this was bigger than optics. It was about operational authority. Legally, Elijah wasn't just a passenger. As a major shareholder, he was entitled to hold the airline accountable through board-level governance. That meant this incident didn't just violate public perception. It triggered clauses that could mandate immediate corporate reform. And here's where the genius of Elijah's approach becomes clear. Rather than threatening lawsuits or demanding personal apologies, he prepared to leverage shareholder pressure, legal governance, and public accountability all at once. In business terms, he turned discrimination into a material incident, a breach that forced the board to act. Then the call came. Lila's phone lit up with a direct line from Chairperson Renard, Silverlight's CEO. She answered. "Yes, ma'am. He's here. I understand. Yes, I'll put him on." Elijah stepped forward, calm as ever. "Hello, Catherine," he said. It wasn't a power move. It was familiarity. "I'm standing in front of your passengers, your crew, and about 5,000 live stream viewers, and I'd like to explain what just happened here before we discuss what needs to change." Silence from the other end. Then, "Please do." Julia's stream was now at 7,800 viewers and rising. Elijah didn't rant. He outlined the facts: paid first-class ticket, valid credentials, dismissal based on appearance, recorded refusals to verify documentation, public humiliation, viral media fallout, boardroom stake, material governance trigger, and he ended with a tone that couldn't be mistaken. "Catherine, this isn't about me anymore. It's about whether Silverlight Airlines wants to be the face of change or the target of history's next great reckoning." You'd expect a story like this to peak at the confrontation: a boarding gate, a call to the CEO, a crowd. But this story was just beginning. What Elijah Monroe did next didn't just respond to the moment. It set fire to an outdated playbook written in silence and double standards. After ending his call with Chairperson Catherine Renard, Elijah didn't raise his voice, threaten lawsuits, or request special treatment. He looked around the gathered passengers, some holding coffee cups frozen mid-sip, others pressing record with trembling fingers. Then he said, "I want to apologize for your delay. But delays sometimes serve a purpose. Today, that purpose is long overdue." He held up a final document, a clause from Silverlight Airlines shareholder agreement. Section 13.4, Material Incidents Triggering Governance Review. In plain terms, when discrimination occurs under Silverlight's flag, it isn't just a PR problem. It's a governance failure. The company is legally obligated to initiate reforms or face shareholder action. Now imagine that from the boardroom's point of view. You've got a CEO being questioned live at a gate, a stock price slipping minute by minute, viral outrage surging online, and a primary shareholder not just demanding reform, but documenting the exact mechanisms by which your institution will be held accountable. Lila Wexler stood frozen. She had gone from gate supervisor to centerpiece in a legal case she couldn't understand, much less control. Captain Granger, now silent, watched the crowd and realized this wasn't a disruption. It was a reckoning. A call came through again, this time to Lila's radio and Elijah's phone simultaneously. Chairperson Renard wanted a video call, live, not in a private room, not behind closed doors. There, at gate 18B, in full view of the passengers who had witnessed it all, Elijah agreed. On a 75-inch monitor in the terminal, Silverlight Airlines boardroom blinked into view. Around the table sat Renard, her VPs, legal counsel, and 3 shareholder representatives. The live stream hit 15,000 viewers. This wasn't a meeting, it was history. Renard's voice was firm. "Mr. Monroe, the board is listening." Elijah didn't begin with demands. He began with data. In Q4 of 2024, he explained, Silverlight Airlines received 162 discrimination complaints, 35% higher than industry average. Most were dismissed. None resulted in formal retraining. Today, that ends. He presented slides streamed from his tablet. Year-over-year breakdown of bias reports, correlation between discriminatory incidents and social media damage corporate travel spend by Monroe Global across 3 major airlines. The takeaway was clear. Elijah had options, but he chose to build with Silverlight. Until now. Then came his terms. 1. Immediate termination of all staff involved in the incident. 2. Deployment of third-party administered bias training across all customer-facing roles. 3. Establishment of a permanent, anonymous discrimination reporting system. 4. A $750,000 fund to support internal diversity initiatives. 5. A public apology acknowledging not just this incident, but the systemic failure that led to it. 6. Real-time implementation within 685 days, 72 hours, or Monroe Global would divest and publicly sever ties. VP of Legal Affairs blurted, "This timeline is unfeasible. Training takes." Elijah cut in calmly. Silverlight Airlines can reassign 6,000 flights in under 8 hours during weather emergencies. You have the systems. What's missing is the will. Renard didn't need more convincing. Agreed. All terms accepted. And with that, Gate 18B erupted in applause. Not polite clapping, but catharsis. Passengers cried. Some shook Elijah's hand. Others just stood quietly, processing what they had witnessed. A black man in sneakers and a hoodie had just rewritten an airline's legacy in under an hour. What happened next wasn't just implementation. It was transformation. Most companies respond to crises by patching leaks. Elijah Monroe built a new pipeline. Within 24 hours of the Gate 18B incident, headlines around the world echoed the same sentiment. A first-class seat turned into a first-class reckoning. But the real story was just beginning behind closed doors, in boardrooms, training centers, and policy war rooms. The next morning, Monroe Global's legal team received confirmation that Madison Sharp, the lead flight attendant, and Captain Russell Granger had been terminated with cause. Not because of viral pressure, but because they failed the most basic expectation of leadership, verification before judgment. Lila Wexler, the gate supervisor, was demoted to training coordinator and ordered to undergo a 6-week intensive on bias awareness and conflict de-escalation. But Elijah didn't gloat. In fact, he cautioned against focusing too much on individuals. This isn't about removing bad actors, he told a group of airline execs in a closed-door session. It's about removing bad assumptions from our systems. His strategy was clear. Personal accountability, balanced with institutional renewal. By day 2, Silverlight Airlines launched a new digital platform, Equifly, a third-party administered tool allowing passengers and employees to report discrimination anonymously. Submissions were routed to an independent review board with real authority, not a PR department trained in denial. Day 3? A surprise. Elijah released Monroe Global's quarterly travel report, and Silverlight's name was still on it. Not only that, they were slotted for a 15% increase in corporate bookings. Confused? Don't be. This wasn't forgiveness. It was proof of concept. Silverlight had responded with action, not spin, and Elijah rewarded results. Let's unpack why this worked. Elijah understood something critical. Corporate pain points are leverage points. The airline's leadership didn't act out of moral clarity alone. They acted because the person demanding change understood their spreadsheets, not just their slogans. He aligned values with economic incentives, and in doing so, made diversity profitable to uphold and expensive to ignore. The results were fast and measurable. Discrimination reports dropped 67% in 3 days. Silverlight stock, after an initial plunge, rebounded 3.4%. Customer satisfaction ratings rose by 14% in 2 weeks. Competing airlines reached out to license the training modules created by Monroe Global's diversity team, But it didn't stop at airlines. Amtrak, Greyhound, 2 hotel chains, all reached out to adapt Elijah's Chen protocol model, now rebranded as the Monroe Framework. At its heart was a simple 3-part mantra: document, audit, act. Each step forced transparency, removed the emotional fog from claims, and created a pipeline for accountability. Systems weren't just patched, they were redesigned. And perhaps most powerfully, Elijah never made it about himself. In one of the most widely shared interviews after the incident, he said, "This isn't about making Elijah Monroe comfortable. It's about making future passengers, who may not own companies, who may not be CEOs, feel like their dignity isn't up for debate." That was the breakthrough. He weaponized his privilege not for personal restoration, but for systemic access. And it worked. 3 weeks after Elijah Monroe stood at Gate 18B, something extraordinary happened. A passenger on a completely different airline, Crescent Airways, filed a complaint using a now familiar template. It cited misconduct, demanded verification procedures, and referenced the Monroe Framework by name. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a ripple. And ripples, when sustained, become reform. Silverlight Airlines, once at the center of public scrutiny, had become a benchmark. Not because it was perfect, but because it responded perfectly to its imperfections. Their Equifly system processed 113 anonymous reports in its first month. More than half were validated. More importantly, every single one was investigated within 48 hours, something unheard of just a month prior. Other airlines began to take notice, not because they wanted to, but because their customers now expected it. It became a competitive disadvantage to not have bias training or a transparent reporting system. Civil rights attorneys began referencing the Monroe Framework in litigation. Training consultancies rebuilt their diversity modules based on it. And federal regulators, well, they saw an opportunity. By the second month, the Department of Transportation issued new guidelines, nicknamed the Silverlight Reforms, requiring all commercial carriers to 1. Track and publicly report all discrimination-related incidents quarterly. 2. Offer third-party complaint resolution systems. 3. Tie executive bonuses to measurable diversity outcomes. Yes, that last part came straight from Elijah's original proposal, and it passed. Why? Because no one wanted to be the next airline trending for all the wrong reasons. Let's pause and reflect on the scale of this moment. This wasn't about one company adjusting a few internal policies. It was about an entire industry being forced to evolve, not by legislation alone, not by protest alone, but by strategic stakeholder leverage backed by data, visibility, and relentless calm. 1 year after Flight 739, Elijah stood at a podium at the Global Equity and Transport Conference, hosted at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. The room was packed. Airline CEOs, union leaders, federal officials, and frontline staff. The backdrop was a massive digital projection of a statistic. Discrimination reports in U.S. air travel down 73% since the Monroe Framework. He opened with this: "I didn't set out to change aviation. I just refused to let a seat assignment define my worth." Then he clicked to a new slide, a map of the U.S. with pins showing where his framework had been implemented: airlines, bus networks, rideshare companies, even several hospitals. Each pin represented a workplace, a customer journey, a quiet moment where someone had been questioned simply for existing. And now, that moment had a process for resolution. And if you're wondering whether Elijah ever flew Silverlight again, the answer is yes. He took the same flight route, sat in the same seat, 1A. But this time, when he boarded, the attendant, a young black man named Deshaun, greeted him not with surprise, but with recognition and respect. "Welcome back, Mr. Monroe. It's an honor to have you with us." Elijah simply nodded and replied, "The honor is in the change, not the seat. Change often begins with confrontation, but it takes root through connection." That truth arrived for Elijah Monroe in the form of an envelope, handwritten, postmarked from Detroit. Inside was a simple letter, no branding, no business seal, just ink on paper and a name signed in careful script. Alyssa Trenton, age 26, MBA graduate, and, as she described herself, someone you unknowingly saved. Alyssa's story was one of thousands. She had boarded a regional flight 2 months prior, with a discounted upgrade to first class, earned with reward points and student discount perks. She was young, black, wearing a hoodie. She was told, very much like Elijah had been, that she was in the wrong seat. Her ID and pass were dismissed. She didn't argue. She moved. No cameras recorded it. No one live-streamed her humiliation. She cried in silence. And that was that. Until Elijah's story. "I watched your video," she wrote. "I didn't even know I needed it. But when I saw you stand calmly, not to prove yourself, but to change the system, I felt something break open in me. I don't want to be invisible anymore." That sentence hit harder than any policy reform. Alyssa wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for meaning. She had joined the Transportation Equity Legal Alliance, a new nonprofit formed by the Monroe Foundation to support passengers like her. She had begun collecting testimonies, building case files, and most powerfully, training others on how to document, respond, and reform. Elijah kept her letter on his desk for weeks, because that letter was more than gratitude. It was a signal. A new generation had been activated, not through slogans, not through hashtags, but through strategy and solidarity. We often assume that system change must begin with power, but Elijah knew better. System change begins when someone with power chooses to use it responsibly, and others see a model worth replicating. That's what Alyssa saw. And in seeing it, she became part of the next chapter. In the months that followed, the Monroe Foundation expanded its reach. 18 new partnerships with public transit systems, 6 civil rights training modules licensed to corporations across sectors, a national reporting database, now federally funded, for all travel-related discrimination claims, and then a twist Elijah hadn't expected. The airline unions came calling, not to challenge him, but to learn. Their members were afraid, not of passengers, but of being the next headline. They wanted real training, not checkbox compliance, and Elijah offered it, graciously, generously, and without ego. "This isn't about you," he said during one of the first union briefings. "It's about what happens when you stop questioning the wrong things and start questioning your assumptions." 12 months to the day after Elijah Monroe was asked to vacate his rightful seat on Flight 739, he stood again, but this time not at an airport gate, not in front of a live stream or a boardroom screen. He stood at the podium of the National Civil Rights Symposium, hosted at the John Lewis Center for Social Equity in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with decision-makers from across the transportation industry, but it was the front row that mattered most. Dozens of passengers who had submitted discrimination complaints in the past year and received actual responses, apologies, and in many cases, justice. The screen behind Elijah displayed a timeline, 12 months of reform. 23 airlines updated their passenger verification procedures. 7 transportation companies tied executive pay to equity benchmarks. Over 46,000 frontline employees retrained under the Monroe Framework reported incidents of discrimination down 71% industry-wide. But that wasn't the slide Elijah paused on. The one he paused on was a collage. Faces. Not his. Theirs. Alyssa Trenton. Deshawn, the flight attendant who welcomed him back. Maria Patel, who testified before Congress about being profiled at a security checkpoint. And dozens more. Each person in the image had taken one small act. Reporting, speaking up, documenting or supporting, and together they had reshaped an entire culture. And then something truly unexpected happened. A woman in the back row raised her hand during Q&A. The moderator hesitated. Q&A had officially ended, but Elijah gestured, inviting her forward. I'm Rachel Strauss, she said into the mic. I was the one who... She trailed off. Elijah knew the name. Everyone did. Rachel had been Madison Sharp, the flight attendant who started it all. After her dismissal, she disappeared from public view. Until now. I want to apologize publicly, again, she said. But also, I want to thank you. Because I've spent the last year learning what I never saw before. I became a diversity consultant. I now work with 5 regional airlines to train staff on unconscious bias. You didn't just change the system, you changed me. The room stood. Some in disbelief, others in quiet respect. Elijah nodded slowly. Rachel, accountability isn't a finish line, it's a beginning. And your courage to return here proves something I deeply believe, that even those who hurt the system can help heal it. That moment defined the true scope of victory, not the graphs, not the media coverage, not the compliance reports, redemption, growth, systems becoming humane. In the final minutes of his speech, Elijah turned to the live stream camera, now broadcasting to over 100,000 viewers. To everyone watching, this was never about a seat. It was about a pattern. It was about how ordinary injustice becomes normalized until someone refuses to sit quietly anymore. I didn't act because I was angry. I acted because I had the tools to fix it. And now you do too. He clicked to the final slide. Document it. Report it. Demand better. Because dignity isn't negotiable. The sun was low over O'Hare Airport as Elijah Monroe boarded Flight 739 again. Same route, same airline, same aircraft. Seat 1A had always been his, but this time, something was different. Not the upholstery, not the legroom, the culture. Deshawn, the young flight attendant who had once greeted him with reverence, was now a training supervisor, responsible for onboarding all new cabin staff into Silverlight's revised Dignity First model. He didn't address Elijah with ceremony. He addressed him with equality. Welcome aboard, Mr. Monroe. Good to have you with us. Thanks, Deshawn, Elijah replied, slipping his briefcase beneath the seat with ease. No fanfare, no scanning glances, no second guessing. Across the aisle, a woman was helping her elderly father get situated. Behind them, a teenage boy in a hoodie and noise-canceling headphones nodded politely as he passed. The cabin was a quiet mosaic of diversity, races, ages, styles, and everyone just belonged. As the plane began taxiing, Elijah looked out the window. He wasn't reflecting on boardroom votes or metrics. He was thinking about the things no one ever sees. The seat that wasn't challenged, the smile that wasn't suspicious, the quiet dignity that wasn't revoked. Sometimes change announces itself, but other times it arrives as a silence, the absence of prejudice, the disappearance of doubt, the stillness of fairness finally doing its job. The flight took off smoothly. No delay, no story, just a journey, like any other. 3 rows behind him sat Alyssa Trenton, notebook open, sketching ideas for the next expansion of the Monroe framework into ground transportation. She didn't introduce herself this time. She didn't need to. Elijah knew she was there, and that was enough. As the aircraft climbed into the evening sky, Elijah opened his laptop, not to draft policy, not to respond to media, but to write a letter. This one, addressed to no one in particular, just a line he wanted to remember. The true measure of change isn't who gets a seat at the front. It's when no one has to earn the right to be treated like they belong. That's what he fought for. That's what he won. And somewhere in a distant terminal, another young man in a hoodie would board his flight, boarding pass in hand, seat 1A, waiting, and no one would blink. That's the real victory. Discrimination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through assumptions, glances, policies left unexamined. But silence is a language of its own, and if we don't interrupt it, it writes the rules for us. Elijah Monroe's story is fictional, but the systems it confronts are very real, and the tools he used, documentation, economic leverage, persistent calm, strategic action, are tools we can all carry. You don't need to own a company to demand change. You just need to refuse to accept inequality as routine. Wherever you sit, make it matter.